But let's get started. So sometime a couple of years ago, I saw a tweet come on my timeline that said, if you blog, and you're using somebody else's network to blog for you, then no matter how good that network is, you're using that network, or you're using your skills to build up that network, rather than to build up your own. And I kind of thought, I got a point there. So I was in bed when I read this, and I immediately grabbed my laptop, and I went out, and I brought a domain. Actually, I brought 3 domains, because who can stop at one? I got myself stacy-clouds.com, .net, and .dev. And as soon as I had those domains, I did nothing. Because, as I'm sure many of us know, buying domains and using domains, they're 2 completely different hobbies. The thing that stopped me in this particular instance was the whole eating the elephant problem. I wanted to make my own site, but I didn't just want to install software. I wanted to use this to experiment with things, to improve my CSS, which you're about to see is not spectacular, and try and use it as a learning experience. But in order to do that, I would have had to spend my time actually building that website. I was going to have to build functionality to fetch blog posts, to display blog posts. I'm going to want to edit them at some point, which means I'm also going to need authentication. And then I've got to host it. And I don't particularly want to pay for hosting, because this is just a hobby. And it all got a little bit much. And in my mind, I made this massive job that I've got to do. And so I never quite got around to it. Then I started playing with Azure static web apps, and I started to see possibilities. It was one single Azure resource. It was free. I could have static files to run my website, and I could have Azure functions to have a serverless API that ran in the background. And I kind of thought, what if I use this? I can make sure that I can do it one step at a time. I don't need to make this awesome, perfect website in the first instance. I can just start with something simple. And when I've got time, just add something to it and move along just a little bit. Use these static front end, use the Azure functions to try and tell the world who I am. So, hi, who am I? I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan here in Amsterdam, where we make financial advice software. I had been developing software since the middle of the 1990s, and for the last 2 years, I've been really honored to be able to call myself a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Now, that's enough of me talking and just showing slides on the screen. Let's see whether or not we can actually get to doing some code. And what I want to do today is actually just set up a new static web app so that we can get started. So first thing that we're going to do is figure out where the screen is. There we go. And what we're going to do is just make a very simple Angular application. It's going to go out to Dev.To, which is where I host my blog site. It's going to read my blog posts and just put them on a web app for me so that I can click out to the original place to just take that first step. So the first thing we're going to do is just spin up an Angular application. So we're just going to ng-new that. We're just going to call it client, because this is my client front-end application. We're going to hope that my computer doesn't get scared about being on stage and stop working. Come on, you can do this. I know it's scary, but you can do this. Says she, hopefully, maybe you can't do this. Isn't technology wonderful? There we go. No, I don't want routing. I'll just use CSS. Let's keep this nice and simple. So what we're going to do now is just open this up in code. And because you really don't want to spend the next 20-odd minutes watching me make lots of typos, I've got a few code snippets to bring over. And for those of you that do want to spend the next 20 minutes watching me do typos, don't worry, I've got some commands I've got to run. I'm sure I'm going to do that for you too. So first thing I'm going to do is just make this a little bit more my application. So I'm going to go into the index.html, and we're just going to call this JSWORLD. See, told you, typo number 1. And hence the snippets. The next thing that we're going to do is replace the original app HTML because you know what? That's a little bit over the top for what I want for my web application. So somewhere up here, we've got a HTML file. And we're just going to delete all of that and just put a little hello, I'm me at the top of my page. Now, we're going to build this, and whilst this is building, because I know this can take some time occasionally, we are going to go and make our Azure function. So let's run our npm install and then go back to our terminal. Now, for the terminal, I'm going to use Azure Functions, which is what you get inside of Azure Static Web Apps. And we're going to make a TypeScript function to just go out to Dev.To and read in some data. So we will try and make this full screen. Thank you. And inside of Visual Studio Code, we have Azure Tools, which can help us do these things. So I'm going to use that in order to create my Azure function. Turn my folder into a project, and we can get started. I'm going to make a TypeScript function. It's going to be a HTTP trigger, and we're not going to call it HTTP function 1 because that's a boring name. We're going to call this blog post summaries because that's what this function is going to get back for us. We're going to try and find the mouse. Now we're going to replace this function, and like I said, this is just a really simple function that is going to use Axios to get some data from the web for us. We're going to go out to Dev.To. They have an awesome API that you can use to do this. We're going to fetch all of the articles, all of the summaries for the articles, for the username Stacy_Cash, which is me. Then we're going to turn that into just some data that I'm going to use inside of my application and send it back to the front end. Now, I see I've got a squiggle in there, and I've got a squiggle in there because I've kind of missed a bit. And that is that we need to, of course, install Axios. Come on, you can really do this, computer. Thank you. So that's now installed, and this is literally all that we need to do for our Azure function at this stage. It's really small, really simple, and should just work for us. Hey, look at that, no typos, impressive. So that's our API. Hopefully our front end has been built now, and it managed to do that without going boom. That's impressive. Now I'm just going to use that Azure function so that we can get our data. First thing I'm going to do is bring in the HTTP client module, because I'm going to use that inside of my service in a second. And we want HTTP client module. Next, I am going to make a service. And that's what's going to go out and actually make the call to my backend. And this is also going to be quite a simple service that literally just goes out and fetches it from the API. Now, the important point in this service is to notice that I am just going to the root of my application and trying to get access to API/blog post summaries. Even though these are two totally separate applications, that's kind of one of the bits that I love about Azure Static Web Apps. It lets us do this. It hides the complexity of actually making this thing work inside of Azure. Next thing is I want to make something so that I can actually display my blog post. So let's just make a component for that. And this is going to... This is just going to take in that blog post summary. No, it's not. This is going to take in a blog post, and then we're going to put that on the page. And this is the only CSS that you're going to see in my app, because otherwise it really does look ugly when you put it out there, and I don't want it that bad, just to try and make our blog post look kind of readable. Some HTML to put them on the page. So we're just displaying the blog post title, cover image if one is available, a brief description if one is available, and then a link back to the original blog post URL, because right now this app doesn't display blog posts, it only displays the summaries. And then two last changes that we need to do in order to use this component. In the app component TypeScript itself, here's where we're going to inject that blog post summary service, and we're just going to put the blog post on the screen underneath my little hello section. And that's it. This is our entire application for today. I'm going to push this up to hello, where is my commit message? We're going to push this up to GitHub. And we're going to hope that the internet is fast enough to do that. And then we're going to switch to a browser. And now we actually get to do the fun stuff, which is actually running our blog posts in production. There we go. So this is my GitHub repo that we've got. It was empty. It should now have something in it. Fingers crossed. Thank you. Now we can come into the Azure portal, and we're going to create this static web app from here. Now you can do this as infrastructure as code, but just for a quick demo, the portal is just easier. So we want a static web app. We're going to create that one. Now, whenever you create anything inside of Azure, always check that the subscription and the resource group are correct. They should be if you create it from inside of a resource, but some of them have bugs, so they don't. So always double check. We're going to call our little app JSWORLD. We're going to use a free tier. Static web apps have two different tiers. They have a free tier for hobbies, where you have some nice things out of the box, and then they've got a much more comprehensive standard tier that costs about a tenner a month, I think, 10 euros. And that gives us access to custom authentication. It gives us access to our edge capabilities for your static website, and just a few other things that make it possible to use inside of the more enterprise environment. We're going to run our static web app inside of West Europe. At least we hope we are. Disclaimer, Azure had an outage last night, and this didn't work when I did it. So fingers crossed they fixed their issues and everything goes OK today. And then we get onto another fun thing about static web apps. I have a link to my GitHub account here, and it's actually going to create me my own CI/CD pipeline to get my application out to the world. So I want to pick my organization. I want my static TypeScript talk, and I want to deploy the main branch. Next thing that we need to do is to say what we're actually building. Now, static web apps have capability out of the box for doing a lot of things. Angular, Blazor, Next, Nuxt, React, Svelte, Vue, Gatsby, Hugo, VuePress, or even your own custom site that you want to deploy. We're going to be using Angular for this one. And then we just need to tell it where it gets its data from inside of our repo so it can build it. The fun one for this is, although we're telling it where it can get its information from, and although we've told it, hey, build Angular, the actual pipeline itself doesn't need to know this. It will look inside of the folders that I specify here, and it will figure out what it needs to build. So I could change from Angular to React to Blazor, and as long as you keep it in the same place, this should just keep on running. Let's review and create this one, spin it up. These things generally get created inside of a couple of seconds. They're really speedy resources to use. Couple of seconds, come on. Thank you. Maybe a bit more than a couple. And here we have our production static web app. We have a URL made for us. We're going to be looking at Kind Forest here. We have a link back to the GitHub repo where it's getting the application from. We can see the deployment history from our runs, and we can even edit the workflow file, which we're not going to be looking into today. Here's our app. Your Azure Static Web App is live and waiting for your content. This isn't really what I wanted to see, because this is just the standard placeholder that you get. Where is my data? Well, my data is apparently in an oops, because something went wrong inside of GitHub. This is cool. Let's try and do this a different way. Wow. OK, it seems that GitHub's down. So this is where we have to go to the wonderful, here's one I prepared earlier for you. When GitHub is working and all this goes as it's supposed to, what you get out of the box is, let's go back to our resource group. And you may notice this one here, JSWORLD safe. Guess why I created this one last night? So inside of this one, we have a different application. And it is exactly the same as we're going to be running locally. And there we have it. We have a very, I promised you an ugly page, and did I not deliver? just listing each one of my blog posts that I've written and just giving us a link so we can open it inside of Dev.To. It is not the most amazing app in the world, but you can see that it's the first step to getting out there, and all of this is running in the cloud when GitHub works and when Azure works without any issues. And we can build that up over time and slowly expand it. Now, one thing that I want to show before we go further, looking at the time, yep. I'm just trying to figure out which demos am I going to show. What I do want to show you is how to run this locally, because as I said when I pointed out where we got our data from, this is just calling my application itself. It's not going out to a different place for my URL. But if I run my Azure functions locally, they're going to be running on port 7071. My Angular application is going to be running on port 4200. We need to make them talk to each other. Thankfully, we have something for that one too, and that is an Azure static web app CLI. This went into general availability just a couple of weeks ago, and it has lots of different functionality. You can init static web apps, you can deploy them, can log into Azure with it. What we're going to be looking at today is actually debugging and just running it locally. So I want to go back inside of code, because what I want to do first of all is, come on mouse, I just want to run my Angular application. So just get that one up and running. Come on, you can't break, you're local, you're not in the cloud. And while that's running, and we're going to assume that it compiled, and of course it doesn't compile okay. What did I do wrong there? I've missed something somewhere, haven't I? I have put data in the wrong place. 2 seconds, we can fix this. So maybe it's good that GitHub broke, because you didn't see my things break. So let's just fix my blog post. No, that works. We have an input of a blog post. We have HTML, which is a blog post. You know what? We have another backup plan that we're going to use. Always have a backup plan when you're going to do live demos, because you never know when you're going to make a mistake without realizing it. So we're going to go into GitHub. And we are going to go into this one. And here we are going to run our application. And then we're going to open up a new window, cd GitHub. And if this is running, no, I don't want to use a different port. I want to close off the other one. Mouse. Honestly, this does work. Come on, serve, that's it. Yeah, you can do this. You worked last night, so you must work this morning too. There we go, we have an application. Now what we're going to do is start our static web apps. That's SWA for static web apps, start. And we are going to link this to localhost. We're going to take our time typing, because it's quicker. Localhost 4200. And we're going to tell our static web app CLI where to get our API from. So API location, and that's going to come from our API folder. This static web app CLI is now going to look in that API folder. It's going to figure out if there are Azure functions available, and it's going to build them for us and make them available. The static web app itself is going to listen on port 4280. It's going to take any request which doesn't have API in it, and it's going to direct that to my Angular application. When it does get a request with API in it, it's going to forward it to my Azure function. And hopefully, if I've not made another mistake, we should now be able to open a new tab, and we should be able to go to localhost 4280. And that should load my application, and then it gets my data. So this is our developer inner loop, how we work locally, how we can debug, and make sure everything's pointing together. The last thing that I want to cover today, though, is authentication, because this is an awesome way to just start to get some content out there. But I want to write my own blog posts, and I want to make my own application to do it, because, like I say, this is just for me to practice and to play with. But only I want to write blog posts. I don't want to make anybody else. I don't want other people to write blog posts on my site. I am not an authentication expert. We have an authentication expert at the company. He is awesome, and I appreciate what he does. Thankfully, inside of a static web app, we have this covered. We have our application that I showed you that's running online, and this is literally running the code that I showed you. It might have been deployed yesterday, but it's running the code I showed you. There is nothing in there to handle any authentication. But we have another URL to use, .auth. This is a special URL which comes from the static web app itself. And it has a couple of interesting locations. One is auth.me. And here we get, if we zoom in a little bit, a client principal. It's null, because I'm not logged in. If, however, I come back to here and I say, you know what, I want to log in, and I want to log in with Twitter. And this will now go out to Twitter. It will ask for my consent, because I've never logged into this application before. It will send me back to my site. I don't have any code to take advantage of my authentication yet, but I am now authenticated. So if I come back to that auth.me, we should see now that we have a client principal which is filled for us. We have an identity provider. We have a user ID. We have the user ID, by the way. I'm not doxing myself here. Every time you log into a static web app, you will get a new user ID. So if I kill this app and make a new one, this one will change. You get your user details, which, because I've logged in from Twitter, is my handle, Stacy_Cash. There are 4 authentication providers that you get out of the box that you can do this with. You can use Azure Active Directory. You can use GitHub, which is in preview but works fine. Both of those will give an email back if you log in with it, which is why I've not used that in this demonstration. And you've also got GitHub, which I'm not even going to attempt to use today, since I've just got a 500. And that will also give you back your GitHub handle. Finally, we see these 2 user roles that we get. Every single person who logs into your app will get these user roles, anonymous and authenticated. This is how we can tell that the person has logged in. We know who they are. And this data is available to us inside of our app via this endpoint. And it's available to us in our Azure functions, obviously not via this endpoint, because it doesn't have the cookie in for the authentication. But it does get injected into the headers as they go through the static web app before they reach the Azure function. And there's an XMS authentication client header, I believe, which contains a base64 string containing this JSON object. And that's how we can check who we are on the front and back of the application. If everybody can log in, how do I still make sure it's only me logging in because I've not had to do something? Well, there we can add a role to users. Inside of our Azure portal, we have role management. Here you can add 25 users with special roles. It doesn't sound much. It's not much. But for a lot of small applications, it's going to be more than enough, because it's only special roles that are needed. Majority of your users aren't going to need to be on this page. If you do need more than 25, you can get a paid account. If you get a paid account, then you can have 25 users inside of this role, which sounds rather similar, because it is. I don't know why Microsoft did that. But with a paid account, you can also not use this portal. You can write your own special Azure function to provide roles for you so you can get it out to your users. I would show you how useful this works, but since this GitHub died, I'm not going to right now, and I'm sure that everybody's getting a little bit hungry. But just know you've got this authentication there. It's built out of the box, and these things are kind of why I love static web apps quite so much. So then, that was an extremely whirlwind tour. We have, in 20 minutes, we created a web app. We fetched data from an external source. We tried to deploy it, but GitHub didn't play ball, unfortunately. And we've had a look at some of the authentication that you get out of the box so that you can easily let users log in with 4 different social providers. It's not the most pretty thing in the world, but you know what? It is that first step, and we can build up. If you have liked what you've seen and you think you want to play with it, then this QR code will take you to the MS Learn documents so you can have a go yourself. I'm also going to put it on Twitter in a few minutes. On that note, I hope that you enjoyed this talk. I hope you're having a fantastic conference, and I don't want to keep you away from lunch any longer, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Well, you get a lot of nice features out of the box.